Good morning, everybody. How we doing today? Welcome to part 3 on the Blue Note 1500 series. I'm sure there's a few people out there who don't need to see all this because they probably know the series pretty well. This is definitely targeting more the beginner, if you're new to jazz. But I think even the newer jazz fans, once you're immersed into the community for a short while, Blue Note artists and albums become quite familiar. And I don't know if anybody out there has the time or is willing to do this, but I would like to see if anybody would take that Savoy montage of album covers I did last week. It's just that a minute and a half long. And count the ones that were familiar to you. And then compare it to the Blue Note 100 that I posted earlier this past week, and see how many of those are familiar to you. And I'm guessing that the Savoy for most people would be 30%, 40% recognized. And I bet you the Blue Note's 80% for most people, sometimes higher. I think once I get a little further in this series, we do a few more labels, it'd be fun to actually do some polling, some questions here, and give a record 3 points if you have it, 2 points if you're looking for it, 1 point if you know about it, and 0 points if you've never heard of it or seen it. And it'd be a really good way to measure what the modern collector is aware of and knows about. And I think it'd be an interesting thing to do. I think maybe I'll put them all into a playlist at some point, so you can just kind of sit there and watch through them and count. You know, oh yeah, I know that one. Oh yeah, I have that one. Oh, I'm looking for that one. And I feel that there's a difference between having something, looking for something, knowing about something, and then having never seen it or known about it. Those would be the 4 levels. And you can know about something without looking for it. Looking for it's definitely that next level. And then obviously owning it's the greatest measure of how popular it is. But it's pretty crazy just how ingrained this Blue Note canon has become in the modern day jazz vocabulary. Even the more obscure titles and artists have a cachet and a value that today's collector knows about. Tone Poet and Music Matters and a lot of the reissue series. I've put light on people like Tina Brooks and Sonny Clark, Ike Quebec, guys who didn't have much love before are getting even more recognized now. And as I've said to almost exhaustion, in 1956, 55, when this stuff was coming out, it was all very periphery. You know, Jimmy Smith was probably the biggest name of the bunch, and even he was still probably selling maybe 10,000 copies of his records in at the time when they were coming out. I think 10,000 records for a Blue Note would have been a pretty outstanding number. And I think there was a lot of Columbia well-distributed jazz records that were doing 50, 60,000 titles. And some of the better titles would get near 100,000. I think Kind of Blue and Sketches of Spain, some of those records got around that mark, 100,000 records. And Miles got in some trouble with Columbia in the 60s when his records weren't doing those sales anymore. But if an average selling Columbia is selling 45, 50,000 copies nationwide, you'd have to think that the average Blue Note's selling 5,000 copies, and that's all being distributed very locally. And all of this dovetails in exactly with what consumers pay for Savoys and Riversides and Blue Notes and Prestiges and Bethlehems. They're rare and expensive because of those reasons. You know, they're hard to find. There wasn't that many. Luckily, they weren't necessarily the party records that got destroyed. Old soul records are tough. Find me a bunch of great copies of Al Green's Let's Stay Together record. Find me 5 really nice mint copies of originals of that. Good luck. You know, I mean, that record's always a very good minus, and that's a good copy. Because it got played to death. It got played at every party for 5 years. You know, I mean, it's such a good record. Al made 4 or 5 great records on the High label, which Motown ends up swallowing up at some point. But those early High record, Al Green records are just outstanding. It's that gospel soul that's got a ton of groove and a ton of funk to it. If you don't know and love Al Green, you should, because he's definitely one of the great soul singers. And they just have that gospel funk, just laid back in that pocket. That hi-hat just, it's so great. I love all those early Al Green records on high. They're outstanding. Anyway, so it is interesting and noteworthy to know just how rare the Blue Note titles were, and yet how commonplace they've become to us. And I think that's pretty interesting stuff. You know, it's certainly a posthumous effect. And it's great that the music's gotten that second life. What's disappointing is how, for some reason, that same value hasn't attached to the Riverside stuff, which is equally good. The Prestige stuff seems to actually sell for pretty good money. Not Blue Note money, but still pretty good money. It's probably the second most. Savoys, a lot of them are so under the radar they don't sell for much at all. And if you live in America, you can collect a lot of the old Savoys. It takes some time to find them, but they're not. A lot of them won't be more than $40. Some will be under 20 when you find them, like an old Eddie Burt record. Half the sellers in America don't know what Eddie Burt is. You know, so the deeper you dive and the deeper you know, the more stuff you can find at a good price because you know what it is, and sometimes the sellers don't know or care. And my favorite sellers on Discogs and eBay are the ones who don't like jazz. You know what I mean? They're rock and roll guys, and that's what they care about. That's what they know about. That means their ignorance on jazz might give you a good deal somewhere here and there. I got a fun episode coming up soon on some of my new arrivals. I bought some stuff in the last month that's been showing up. Got some fun stuff in there. But let's dive into the 1500 series here. And 1550. And Hank Mobley is back on the platter once again. And Mobley is the ubiquitous Blue Note artist. He just plays with such a panache, such a chameleon. He can adapt to any color palette. And I think when he plays with Art Farmer, you'll hear a side of Hank that you don't hear when he plays with Lee Morgan or Donald Byrd. It's more melancholy. It's more soft. His tone softens. Some players, you get what you get no matter who they're playing with. Lee Morgan's always going to be lava. Hank Mobley is very much an adaptable player. And Art Farmer, like I say, he doesn't make any records as a leader on Blue Note, but he does show up a ton as a sideman here in the 1500 series. Doug Watkins rounds us out with Horace Silver and Art Blakey. So again here what you have is nearly a Jazz Messenger record. You have Mobley, Watkins, Silver, and Blakey that are all Jazz Messenger alumni. Of course, Art Farmer never really was a Jazz Messenger. But 1550, great record. And Mobley's really starting to come into his own here. 1551, 1552 are two Jimmy Smith at the organ with Lou Donaldson, Kenny Burrell, and Art Blakey. And I think Lou Donaldson is a wonderful fit with Jimmy Smith. Jimmy Smith, of course, is going to start becoming more of a soul jazz guy in the 60s. And Lou Donaldson also is going to go that way, especially when he comes back from Argo and Cadet. But with Kenny Burrell and Blakey, it's just a great quartet set. I think this is live stuff, if I recall. And a lot of the Jimmy Smith discography is live stuff, but he was so electric. He was just so on fire all the time, you know. And those people who don't recognize the ability of Jimmy Smith, to me, they don't know what they're talking about. These people who are out there talking about jazz virtuosity, it's so important. They got to be Jimmy Smith is one of the most dynamic virtuosos in this form. Few people could blow it and throw it down like the great Jimmy Smith. And there's a lot of the free cats, the avant-garde cats, the new thing cats, hard bop cats, bebop cats that, for all their ability, didn't do half the innovating and didn't have half the dexterity that Jimmy Smith has on an instrument that's much tougher to play. And it's not tough to play in a swinging, blurting groove sense, in an R&B sense, in a gospel sense, but to play it with a degree of virtuosity and to play a bebop on an organ, it was unthought of. No one before Jimmy Smith even imagined that as a thing. And Jimmy Smith will just do things at times that make your hair stand on end. And if you don't hear and if you don't recognize this guy's incredible ability, it makes me really think that you're not listening. It makes me think that a lot of people spend so much time just reading what other people think and not thinking for themselves. Jimmy Smith will blow your doors off. One of the most interesting anomalies in the 1500 series is number 1553. And it was a number that was never issued. And there's a few other numbers that come up in the sequence, especially once we get in the 4041, 4200, where the albums weren't issued, but there was an album slated for that number, designated, and it got shelved and didn't come out, but that number was reserved for that record, and it'll actually come up later, and it will kind of fill that gap. But from my knowledge, 1553 was never associated with a release. And that goes back probably 5-10 years when I was doing my research trying to find all this stuff. There was nothing I could find that filled that. Maybe in the last 5 years, they've issued whatever that was supposed to be, and someone out there knows that, oh yeah, this record here by so-and-so. But I struggle to think of who it could be. I don't think Jackie McLean has anything that early as on a Blue Note leader. Again, if anybody knows what 1553 was supposed to be, I would love to know. Maybe Sonny Clark's first session. It's possible because his record starts showing up at this point. But it seems like if it was Mobley, it certainly would have been issued by now. Morgan, same thing. So, again, I don't know why they skipped 1553. 1554 and 55, again, are Blakey records, but not Jazz Messenger records. And again, that's because Blakey is not under contract to Blue Note as the Jazz Messengers. So we can do live sessions as the Jazz Messengers, or we can do kind of solo records, as these are, Drum Orgy Volume 1, Orgy and Rhythm, and they're very much percussion-driven sessions with a ton of percussion instruments on there. Wendell Marshall plays bass, Ray Bryant, the great stride groove R&B piano players on the piano. Herbie Mann plays the flute, and Herbie Mann doesn't make a lot of appearances on Blue Note, but here he does show up. But the rest of it is pretty much all that percussion guys, and a lot of them are Latino. Joe Jones, Specs Wright, Sabu, Potato Valdez, Jose Valiente, Ubaldo Nieto, Evilio Quintero. These cats are all playing all kinds of interesting instruments. Timbales, congas, timbales, tree log, maracas, canceros. I don't even know what some of those are myself, but if there had to be a weakest record in the 1500 series, it might be these two, but they're still really fun, and they're actually good Blue Note 1500s that you can get for a good price for originals. Because most of the stuff in this series goes for astronomical money, and you can find those for not too much, and they're still great. And if they were on Prestige, they'd be some of the better material on Prestige at times. On Blue Note, it's probably, and I've said this before, if you look in the Penguin Guide to Jazz or any of the real great jazz publications that rates records, the entire Blue Note discography from about 1530 through about 4200, everything gets 3 to 5 stars. Low marking Blue Notes still get 3.5 stars. And there's so much continual great material that most of it gets 4, 4.5 stars. And there's very few Blue Notes that rank 2.5, 2 stars. This doesn't really happen. More Jimmy Smith, 1556. One of my favorite covers in the Blue Note canon. Leonard Feather does the liner notes here. Of course, Rudy Van Gelder. This is with the great Eddie McFadden, Donald Bailey, and then Art Blakey plays on a couple tracks as well. And again, Eddie McFadden is a great rhythm guitar player who doesn't get records as a leader anywhere that I know of. But he backs up Jimmy Smith for a lot of his late 50s dates. And he's just a great cat that I really feel like he kind of replaced Thornell Schwartz. And I wish I knew more about Eddie McFadden. There's not a lot of information out there. One of the great classics now is 1557, and we're starting to get into hallowed ground now. We're starting to really get into the quantification of what the Blue Note sound is. And if you look at the 10-inch series with Blue Note, they're still struggling to find an identity. They're leasing stuff from European recordings. They're looking for whoever they can find that's available. There's a lot of white cats, a lot of black cats. There's Dixieland, New Orleans sound. There's a lot of things going on in the 10-inch series. And there's not that consistency of Blue Note sound. It's not a defined Blue Note sound. And it's not to say it's not mostly good stuff. It is. But it's not the Blue Note sound yet. And in the first 20, 30 releases of the 1500 series, some of it's obviously that 10-inch stuff being reissued. But even the new material coming out, it's still kind of slowly finding that identity. The Thad Jones records are great, but they're not really the Blue Note sound. They're close, they're getting there, they're not quite there. And the first ones that really kind of capture, I think, are some of the Jazz Messenger live records and some of the Horace Silver. But by 1557 here, we're about to go on a streak of incredible records that capture what Blue Note was about. And there's an urgency and a militancy. And for those of you who've watched me for a long time, I've said all this a lot. But for those of you who are new to the channel, it's important for you people to understand. The Blue Note legacy is what it is today because of the integrity and the honesty and the vitality, the desperation that Alfred and Frank allowed these brothers to show in their music. They weren't just playing pretty. They weren't playing commercial. There wasn't a ton of governance in terms of, we need you to make this a hit record. We need you to play these Broadway show tunes. That's a big show tune. That production is popular right now. Will you play Oklahoma? Will you play? And Blue Note didn't put those guidelines on people. And as I said before, they didn't do Christmas records. They don't do greatest hits records. They don't do label compilations. It's just a focused, relentless grind of putting out angry, young, politicized, socially conscious black music. And the souls each of these men play are improvised, emoting in the same sense of a hip-hop MC freestyling. And there's such an honesty of a man pouring his soul and conscious spirit into his horn versus the programmed cliches of lyrics and MCs. And as much as an MC might be freestyling, he's going to fall back on cliches. He's going to fall back on certain couplets and verses of rhyme that he knows and that he's written. And it becomes very much a set of cliche phrasings and boasting. And oftentimes it doesn't even represent how I actually feel right now. It's a predetermined outcome. And so I was involved with some hip-hop crews back in the day, and the freestyling, most cats were repeating themselves even though they're supposed to be freestyling. They'll be using a lot of things that they usually do when they freestyle. These jazz cats, when they get into their chance for their bars, there's 16 bars here, there's 32 bars here, there's no need to fall back on cliches or familiar phrasing or the same essential guided path. Because I know my instrument well enough, and I know these tunes well enough, and my rhythm section is holding this whole thing together so efficiently. And think of the piano, bass, and drums as the hip-hop track, the beat. You know what I mean? And the beat's got to be good. When the beat is good and the groove is there, these MCs can throw down from their soul, their heart, and their conscience some of the most deep, philosophically, socially challenging, lyrical content that's ever been made in the history of man. And until you hear that, if you're just hearing virtuosity and music, you're missing the point. This is black men venting their experience in America. And there's a reason why white Americans shied away from this type of jazz. There's a reason why the record stores are filled with thousands of shitty white jazz pop records. Thousands of them. And those records sold really well in the 50s and 60s, And that's what everyone was buying, and everybody was like comfortable with that. And you brought home one of these black records, and boy, what are they so upset about? You can feel the tension and the aggression and the passion, and it's powerful, and it's not meaning to pussyfoot. It's not stepping lightly and gently around. It's pretty much plundering right out into the open and saying, you know what? I am tired of the noose around my neck, and my trumpet is going to let you know how I feel about it. And that makes this series of Blue Note recordings, 57 through 60, 61, one of the most important building blocks as we head towards civil rights. And Prestige was thrown together sessions by mostly junkies looking for immediate payouts. They were very loose, a lot of just like open blowing sessions. Not to say there's not some great records on Prestige, but it's not the focused, concentrated effort of these men who got paid to rehearse at Blue Note. All the other record labels were recording a slew of white artists in there trying to cross over, and Blue Note doesn't have any time for white artists at this point. Once that J.R. Monteros record comes out, there's no more white artists making records at Blue Note. Pepper Adams makes a lot of records as a sideman, and he's half a brother from Detroit with the boys. But there's just not any compromise. So Morgan here, 15th to 57, to me, this really is the tipping off of an incredible streak of thirsty, hungry music. Gigi Grice shows up on this, and Grice is kind of an underappreciated cat in jazz circles. Great composer, a great arranger, a great sax player as well, that kind of wasn't really comfortable in his own skin, and he makes some really charged stuff, and then kind of pulls himself out of the scene by mid-60s, which is kind of sad. Benny Golson's on this as well, and Golson's still with us, a great tenor player, a small fella that back in the days in Philadelphia, he worked with Lee Morgan and John Coltrane. Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, and Charlie Persip are the rhythm section here. Persip's really underrated and underappreciated, and Chambers and Kelly, to me, whenever you have Paul Chambers and Wynton Kelly, you can count on that record being explosive. And so now we're going to really dive into some really powerful stuff here. This is Rollins, Volume 2, J.J. Johnson, Horace Silver, Thelonious Monk, Paul Chambers, and Arthur Blakey. This is what we've been listening to in the background. I've been trying to keep the volume down on that so we don't get censored by the YouTube bots. Johnny Griffin. This is his second, if I recall, Blue Note session, and boy, is this a great record. It's all that dexterity and virtuosity of Johnny Griffin here is focused into a very vitriolic laser of precision, cutting through the veil of oppression and darkness. And he's backed up here with Hank Mobley and Coltrane also playing the tenors. So you got Griffin and his incredible dexterity, Coltrane and his incredible sincerity, and then Mobley with his kind of soft, things are going to get better. And you add Lee Morgan to that mix on the trumpet, and what you have here is jazz royalty, again with Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, and Art Blakey. And again, jazz messenger-wise, Griffin, Mobley, Chambers wasn't a messenger, but Blakey, Morgan, there's a lot of jazz messenger alumni on all these records. And I did an episode not that long ago about how, if you look at the Blue Note legacy, it's really written in the jazz messenger font. It's really established by the entire jazz messenger kingdom. And it makes Blakey and Silver kind of these leaders of this sound, and they should be remembered and revered greater than they are. 1560, now here's Hank Mobley really kind of coming into his own. Originals of this go for thousands of dollars. This is a wonderful classic record reissue from the late 90s. Just called Hank. Great cover, no question about it. And again, all those same things apply to this record. And here you have Donald Byrd, who again is not a leader at Blue Note yet, but he's on a lot of these records. John Jenkins on the alto, who's a fantastic fiery player, with Mobley. Bobby Timmons, who's going to be a messenger shortly, Wilbur Ware, and Philly Joe Jones. So again, it doesn't seem to really matter which of the horsemen they saddle up. But whoever it is they pull out of that stable for this session, they're all going to have this kind of focus and intensity And it's really incredible. 1561 is Sabu Martinez. This is one of the ones I forgot when I was pulling the records out. I forgot about this one. It doesn't fit in this discography as well as most of the other stuff. He played with Silver. He's a percussion guy. A lot of this is percussion driven with Arsenio Rodriguez on the conga, Israel Moses Kike Treviso on the conga, Raul Cesar Treviso on the conga, Ray Mosquito Romero, Evaristo Barro, Willie Capo, and Sara Barro on the vocal. So it seems like it's pretty much an island confection here. It's a sweet little thing. You know what I mean? It's a nice record, and it's probably a nod somewhat to what Dizzy Gillespie was doing with Cuban jazz, Latin flavored thing. But it's not that Blue Note thing. You know what I mean? It's kind of a rare exception. Here's a classic records, and then here's an original of 10 pieces of silver. Oh, sorry, stylings of silver, number 1562. And often if I have a reissue of something and I come across an original for a good price, I'll grab the original just for happiness' sake. 47 West 63rd. So that would make this the second address. So probably a second pressing. But again, Silver, he's not the heroin junkie that Mobley and Blakey and some of those other cats are. And on my episode the other day, I queried, did they have a falling out? And someone responded that they did have a falling out, and it was largely, as I speculated, about drugs. It's not well documented. I've not stumbled across that information. And maybe that's not something that they want to put in the average Blue Note story. Sometimes I'm just disappointed how superficial a lot of documentaries are. They don't really delve into a lot of the racial significance and the potency and even the music. A lot of times it's just talking a lot about very surfacey things and just kind of the history. And I'm kind of disappointed sometimes watching documentaries how much they don't emphasize the meaning of all this stuff. But Silver here is with Farmer, who's in Silver's group for a little while. Mobley's in the group for a little while. With Louis Hayes, who's also a member of Silver's group for a while. And then Teddy Kodak's on the bass. And Kodak's not somebody you see a lot. And I just noticed here it says Art Farmer performs courtesy of ABC Paramount. And Art does make a couple of nice records at ABC, but not a lot. 1563. Jimmy Smith was, of course, still being prolific. They rely on Smith and his sales to help keep the label afloat. It's a very important aspect of the Blue Note story, is that for all the militancy and potency, the absolute virtuosity of Jimmy Smith and the amount of fun that his records are makes these records sell pretty well, and it definitely keeps them out there in the public eye. So that's 1563. He plays at the organ, plays Pretty Just For You. I'm trying to remember who's on this. I think it's just bass and guitar. I mean, drums and guitar, yeah. Eddie McFadden and Donald Bailey. So another great little record. And Jimmy Smith records, they're the kind of Blue Notes you can play at a party and socialize, and there's not going to be a palpable pall in the air. You put on some of these charged Blue Note records at a party, and there's going to be kind of an almost awkwardness among white people because Chuck D is speaking, but there's 5 of them. You know, and Chuck D can make some white folks uncomfortable. Believe that. You know what I mean? Curtis Mayfield could say some things that might make white folks be a little uneasy. And you better believe that when 5 brothers are speaking through their horns and their instruments, throwing down the thunder, saying, we won't stand for this anymore, it can make white people subconsciously go, why am I uneasy right now? And uneasy is what you will feel. Paul Chambers, Quintet, 1564. This is a tough record to come by. This is a Japanese pressing. Again, there's Jazz Messenger alumni here with Donald Byrd, Clifford Jordan, Elvin Jones joins the crew here, and Tommy Flanagan, who doesn't show up on Blue Note a ton, but he does at times. Great cover. Like I said, one of the toughest records to find original copies of, and that record will go over $1,000 pretty much every time. 1565 is Cliff Jordan and Lee Morgan. Cliff Jordan, of course, is a Chicago guy. A very powerful, kind of Sonny Rollins-like tone, bluster, a lot of angst. He's playing again with Lee Morgan, Curtis Fuller, John Jenkins, Ray Bryant, Paul Chambers, and Art Taylor. It's a nice record. This is a tough one to find as well, for sure. 1566, one of my favorite Lou Donaldson records. This is the Quintet, Swing and Soul. Fantastic Hallmark Reed Miles album cover. This is with Herman Foster, who I believe this starts his relationship with Herman Foster right here. Herman Foster plays piano on a lot of Lou records for a while. Even when he goes over to Argo for a while, Herman Foster goes with him. And Herman Foster gets a nice record at Argo that's worth finding if you could find it. Peck Morrison's on the bass, Dave Bailey, and Ray Barretto. And Lou will add Ray Barretto on the congas on about half of his records coming up in the next 5 years. And it's amazing how Ray Barretto takes some of that edge off. And Lou's a little bit older than a lot of the other younger Blue Note cats. You know, Lee and Donald and Hank, those guys are kind of younger, young guard. And Lou's a little older, a little, I won't say wiser, but he's like a little bit more from the old swing cat school of, I'm not going to stir the pot. I'm making a living. I got beans on my plate. Let me just do this. And it's important to understand that those guys opened the door for these young cats to come through. You know, if America hadn't become comfortable with Armstrong and Basie and Duke and the great swing cats, if America hadn't learned to hear those black musicians, there's no way these guys would have had that chance. And Lou is a wonderful go-between between the Ben Websters and the Johnny Hodges and the modernity of the Jackie McLeans and the John Jenkins that come later on the alto sax. So that's a great record, great cover. One of my favorite, probably my second favorite Lou Donaldson record. This is Curtis Fuller's first record as a leader. He showed up as a sideman a few times. One of the first old Blue Notes I ever found. Beautiful old copy. And there's Fuller on the cover. And Fuller, for my money, is probably the third greatest trombone player of this era. And he's the greatest hard bop trombone player, period, bar none. But in terms of his ability, and he's a very dexterous, fine player, but then you hear J.J. Johnson, and then you hear Jimmy Cleveland, and you recognize that, okay, there's another level yet of that clear tonality and finite melodic sense. And Fuller definitely is a great player, but he's a little bit more angry and emotional, and there's a little bit more, it lacks clarity some, compared to those guys who are just finite. But again, he's so charged and so part of this young crew. He's really kicking a lot of energy out of that trombone. And his playing on Blue Train, the great Coltrane record, was the first time I really heard trombone, this is 20 years ago, and recognized what you could do with a trombone. You kind of don't really realize that trombones can be that agile until you hear some of these players playing it. Because it was, in the swing era, it was much more of a blurting thing. You muted it to make sounds. You could really bend it, and you could really shape the trombone's tone. It's an incredibly diverse horn, and actually mimics the human voice quite well at times, so it can almost sing to you. You can almost create a vibrato with certain mutes. The trombone's a great underused instrument in bebop and hard bop, and Fuller is one of the great proponents of it. Tough record to come by without question. 1568, another one of the classic Hank Mobley titles. This is Blue Note royalty right here. This is with Curtis Porter on the alto and tenor, Bill Hardman on the trumpet, who makes some great records at Savoy and was a member of the Messengers in 57. Hank Mobley's on the tenor, of course. Sonny Clark is on the piano, and this might be one of the first Sonny Clark appearances, and Clark changes the landscape. And then Chambers and Taylor round this one out. And I've spoken on Sonny Clark a lot, but boy, does he ever bring a socially focused consciousness to the records he's on. It's almost ubiquitous, the potency of records that Sonny Clark is on. They're aggressive, they're up-tempo. It's like he's a coach giving that halftime speech, making his players rah, 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 ready to go. He just seems like he's enough of a leader. Intellectually, spiritually, the other kids seem to look up to him. And it seems like when Sonny's leading the charge, it's going to give you that prototypical Blue Note sound. And I've delved into that before, so I won't expand on that. But really, Sonny Clark is a name that should be looked after and sought after in all instances. Bass on top, Paul Chambers. I believe this is his third and final Blue Note. He goes on to VJ, makes a couple nice records there after this. And then he doesn't do a lot of leading. He joins, of course, Miles' group. And then him and Wynton Kelly and Jimmy Cobb end up going their own way and working at Verve, making a slightly more commercialized product, backing other groups. But the Cobb, Kelly, and Paul Chambers rhythm section is outstanding. He does some bowing of the bass on this that I think is just beautiful and contemplative, surreal. It's when you hear that bass being bowed, it's got a melancholy and a mystical quality to it that's very thought-provoking and death march almost. It's got like real dark tones to it. Burrell's on the guitar here with Hank Jones, Paul Chambers, and Art Taylor. And with Burrell and Hank Jones, you have two of the most empathetic players in jazz history. Burrell and Hank Jones both are brilliant at putting what the leader is trying to get across onto wax. You know, and part of that's being a great listener. That's a real key here, is you have to be a great listener to be a great jazz player. And Burrell obviously was very empathetic and sensed his settings and what the session was supposed to be about. And he could play a lighthearted bossa nova thing with a grass skirt, or you could be part of a dark Blue Note session, and Burrell will give you the right shading and colors for all that. And Hank Jones is absolutely probably the most underrated guy I can think of. And my respect for Hank Jones has only grown and grown. Jean-Michel has validated that over and over, and he knew Hank Jones fairly well. And as I've delved deeper into Hank Jones, his work as a sideman is just prolific. His work on the great rhythm section is everywhere. He's also a chameleon where he can adapt to any setting. But it's great to hear Hank Jones on Blue Note. He's on the great Cannibal Adderley Something Else, which we'll cover here in a minute. He is one of the great players in finding the right and very often the most mystical and haunting phrases on the piano. He'll give you some haunting stuff where he'll just tinkle down your spine and you'll be like, ooh, Hank, I didn't know we knew each other like that.